Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, David. Everybody, this is Professor David Thunder. He's a political philosopher from a university in Spain. You're also an advocate of bottom-up federalism, which I love. And I wanted you to come on and talk because I love your no-nonsense approach to the COVID narrative. Absolutely brilliant. And obviously, in philosophy, you're a thinker. And as you and I were saying yesterday, people are not thinking anymore. They're being taught what to think. So let's get straight into it. And one of the things that you absolutely wanted to tackle was this whole issue of this shift to coercion in public health and policing. Let's get straight into it, David.
Sure, yeah. Basically, it used to be the case that public health was managed through advice that was given to citizens. For example, wash your hands, take this medicine if you're sick. Perhaps if you're sick during an epidemic, stay at home, and citizens would responsibly take on board that advice in their personal circumstances and act on it if they believed that it was wise and if they agreed with it. But during this pandemic, remarkably, there was a massive turn to coercion. Basically, we will coerce you for your own good into behaving responsibly. And one of the terms I use to describe this is collectivism, a turn to collectivism, where basically, instead of trusting individual citizens to make the right choices in their lives, we trust experts who then act on behalf of all of us, right, and tell us how to live, essentially. And this indicates a very profound distrust in citizens, in their judgment, in their ability to make responsible choices. And it's not just coercion, it also leads to manipulation, because when you distrust citizens and you treat them like children, what you end up doing is then you decide, well, we'll use fear, we'll manipulate them, we'll pull on their emotional strings so that they will fall into line instead of using reason. Instead of actually reasoning with them and explaining the situation, we exaggerate the fear so that they will fall into line.
Right.
So that's very disturbing to me, basically, because it totally distorts the relationship, the proper relationship between rulers and ruled, between governors, legislators, and governors and citizens, which should be a relationship of trust and an adult relationship. But now it's turned into a paternalistic relationship between a kind of a manipulator or a kind of an expert and the uneducated children who have to learn from the expert how to live.
Yeah, exactly. So this turn to collectivism, you and I were talking yesterday, and I think one of the comments you said is what we're dealing with is an overreaction to a genuine issue.
Yeah, that's right. I think very few people, there are a few radical COVID denialists out there who might say that, COVID is some sort of invention. I'm certainly not one of them. Right. There was a genuine, if you just talk to doctors, if you look at statistics, hospital statistics, it's very clear that there was an epidemic, a pandemic that came out of China, or at least that is closely associated with China. It seems to have come from a laboratory in Wuhan. A lot of people are now accepting that. And this caused an unusual amount of stress on hospitals, and it also caused an excess mortality, genuine excess mortality. So there's no doubting that. However, it's also true to say that authorities interpreted this pandemic in much more dramatic terms than it needed to be interpreted. And I would attribute that in part to China's reaction, which basically was putting their citizens under lockdown, essentially under house arrest, in a systematic way, indiscriminate way. And this was shown on the media. This was transmitted to the world media. And then they gave the impression that they got the disease under control. So a lot of Western countries looking at this, I think, thought, well, maybe coercion is the answer. Maybe just lockdowns are the answer. And Neil Ferguson, who is one of the architects of the UK lockdown, an expert, a mathematician, and kind of an epidemiologist as far as more at the theoretical mathematical level, he made projections that were way, way wrong. I mean, he said that 500,000 UK citizens would die if there was no intervention. And he himself admitted that these sorts of heavy-handed interventions would not have been possible had it not been for the precedent of China. We just wouldn't have had the stomach for this. But China put on this grand theater, okay, and in the literal sense of a spectacle that we could all watch. And people were supposedly dying in the middle of the streets in China, right? How much of this was put on for our benefit? How much was accurate? It's very difficult to know.
Right.
But even if it did happen, even if people were dying in the streets, it was clearly depicted in a very theatrical way. Yes. And we received that. And I think, UK citizens, Western citizens in general, when they saw what happened in Italy in particular, with the hospitals overflowing with people and people dying, which was very tragic. But I think it then led to an enormous amount of fear. And it's very difficult to make a balanced decisions when you're overwhelmed with fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And fear was an incredible way to get us all to comply, right?
Yes, I think that there are two things we have to distinguish between two things. One is the natural fear that arises out of disease and death, which is just something that's going to happen. We're all afraid of death. I mean, any normal person is afraid of death. The other thing is a fear that is manufactured. That's different. That's manufactured by propaganda and by deliberate policy. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So one of the subcommittees of SAGE, of the British kind of medical advisory committee on the pandemic, one of their subcommittees actually was dedicated to, one of their tasks was to come up with policies that would instill fear in citizens and would stoke their fears. And a number of those members of that committee came out later on with regrets. And they said publicly that they felt it was unethical what they had done, because really the job of advisors and the job of governments is to advise, give good information to citizens so that they can act responsibly. Their job is not to stoke citizens' fears, to manipulate citizens' emotions, to nudge them through fear into action. But this is exactly what they did. And they had regrets. Why did they have regrets? Well, partly because it was just intrinsically unethical what they were doing, and partly because they saw the consequences of that, which was a society that is terrified and that does not have a sense of proportion in response to this single threat, which is only one of many, many threats that can face a society. It's not as if COVID is the only disease out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is obviously part of the problem, because as you say, is there are many problems attached to lockdown, and not least like in the UK, for example, we're talking about millions of people waiting on the waiting list. Now, of course, the British government are using COVID as a shield to cover all manner of problems and iniquities that have gone on for the last 10 years at the hands of the same government. And the NHS is one of them. They've been depleting that for almost 10 years now. And the judiciary, for example, there's a problem there as well. And COVID is just being used for all of it. But one of the things you said to me yesterday, which I thought was really interesting, is you said citizens get discouraged and disheartened if the state is not on your side. And you said historically, that's not true. Expand on that for me.
Yeah, basically, to be a citizen, first of all, I just say to be a citizen is to, in a positive sense, is to believe in a shared project. And what is the shared project that we citizens participate in? Well, it's called constitutional democracy. Okay, and in a constitutional democracy, we have equal standing before the law, and we have a limited government. Okay, so we have a government that has to act in accordance with consistent rules that respect the rights of citizens. And there are times that when governments, because they're made up of human beings, just go wrong, they take a wrong path, and they can even oppress citizens, they can enslave citizens, they can imprison citizens unjustly. And the job of citizens is to be vigilant and to respond to government abuses, even under difficult circumstances. So I just think of some of the movements that I've been inspired by are, for example, Mahatma Gandhi's movement against British colonialism and its unjust treatment of Indians. And Gandhi had a philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And for him, you have to expose the wound of injustice by going out and, in a way, forcing the hand of the government to react to you and to what you stand for. And so, and then Martin Luther King, interestingly, in the racial civil rights movement in the United States, what he did was he was inspired by Martin Luther King's nonviolent resistance, combined with his Christian convictions, the Christian convictions of Martin Luther King, because he was a Christian. And what he said was, he basically said, we have to stand against violence and injustice at the hands of the state. Right. But it's very, very important that even if the state is against us, and even if the state uses violence against us, he said, we have to retain our dignity. We cannot sink to the level of the state when it is acting like that. And so he trained the people who were in his group, he trained them to basically maintain their poise, to not have recourse to violence, and to engage in peaceful civil disobedience, non-compliance. Right. And what did they achieve? They basically were instrumental in securing civil rights for African Americans. Right. And it wasn't as if he was imprisoned for his convictions. So we have to be prepared. When I say we, I mean people who really understand what's at stake, understand that lockdowns and coercion surrounding public health are just inappropriate. Yes. We have to sometimes put our neck on the line. We have to take risks. And it's easy to say it and it's hard to do it. But the fact is that if people do not take risks, then I think that we have a very dark future ahead of us. Because if we don't take risks, the government will just keep getting away with what it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? It's gone from 2 weeks to save the NHS to vaccine passports. And I mean, you tackle so many brilliant, important subjects, the rise of authoritarianism, and obviously, this is obviously what you've been saying is a strategy for the pushback that we need against this tyranny. And as you say, sometimes we just have to be prepared to put our necks on the line in order to be able to do that. And it is hard though, isn't it? It's really hard.
Yeah, it's very hard because people can lose their reputations by speaking out on this issue. People have lost their jobs. People have been not been promoted because of taking these kinds of taking these stances. I'm fortunate that intellectual freedom is still respected in my university, so I'm able to speak out without necessarily putting my job in jeopardy. And so I don't want to, I'm not coming at this sort of as some sort of moralist who's going to tell people, you're a bad person if you don't speak out, because that is a personal choice that people have to make. So I wouldn't force that on anybody. I wouldn't tell them they're a bad person if they don't do it. But what I can say with great confidence is that basically how we come out of this in the end will depend on the heroism of a few. So some individuals will have to speak out in order for us to be able to hold the government accountable for what they've done and what they're doing. So in that sense, I guess it's more like a call to people to sort of examine their conscience, examine our consciences, and ask ourselves, am I doing enough? Am I speaking out? And if I'm not speaking out, I might have a very good reason for not speaking out. Okay, so that's possible. But what I'm saying is, let's consider the possibility that maybe I should speak out, or do what I can, use my expertise, my talent, put it channel my talents to try to improve the situation. So like, as an example, I mean, I do think there are practical things people could do. And in one of my videos, I do suggest a few steps. One is this idea of freeing your mind, because if you don't educate yourself about the facts, if you don't understand what's going on, you're much more susceptible to propaganda manipulation at the hands of experts, you know. So educate yourself, educate others, help others understand the situation as well in a respectful way, in a civil way, and build social capital, build a network of peers who can see things more or less, can see that there's a real problem here. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of community, build community. And it may not be an official government kind of project, but that doesn't mean it's not valid. It doesn't mean it's not useful to build these community networks. And one of the things I do say is nurture pockets of freedom. Even if you feel that there's less and less freedom in certain areas like YouTube or Twitter, well, as you're doing yourself, like, let's find these platforms, let's find these, you know, these kind of corners of society where we could still speak freely, where we could still live freely in our home, in our community, with our friends, with our colleagues. You know, government, no matter how powerful it becomes, it cannot systematically remake all of the social fabric. There will always be pockets of freedom in society, and we have to exploit them and take advantage of them, just as the Poles did under communist Russia, you know, where they had underground theater and they had underground meetings and so on, even under communism. We haven't gotten to the point where we're under communism. We still have a lot more freedom that the Poles had under communists.
Right. Right, got you. Listen, David, I'm going to have to let you go, unfortunately, because we started late. I could listen to you all day. Thank you so much for joining us. I urge everybody who's watching to check out David's videos. They're absolutely brilliant, forthright, straight to the point, no messing. David, thank you so much. Have an excellent day and hope to speak to you very soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Take good care of yourself. Thank you.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.